Welcome to the final part of the final day of the symposium. I'm going to attempt to wrap up and offer some overarching comments and reflections. And in a sense, I really don't know quite where to start. There's been talk of boomer waffen, porcupines. I've even learnt about how to poach attendees from other rival conferences, which is something I'm going to take back with me to Swansea. But in these remarks, I'm just going to focus on two things. One that I think has been quite prominent throughout the symposium, and one that maybe has been more latent that I would like to draw to the surface. So starting with the thing that's been prominent, first of all, and I just want to start this with an anecdote. I had a PhD student in Swansea that conducted an ethnographic study of PREVENT. So essentially, he shadowed the Swansea PREVENT team to try and understand the practical implementation of PREVENT locally. And one of the questions that arose, this was back in about 2018, 2019, one of the questions that arose concerned ideology. So in the UK, PREVENT sits within the wider counter-terrorism strategy. It aims to support at-risk individuals from being drawn into terrorism and to de-radicalise those convicted of terrorism offences. What the Swansea practitioners were coming up against was school children, some primary school children, so age 11 or under. So school children that had developed an obsession with US school shootings. These young people also tended to have significant other support needs. The practitioners faced a dilemma. There was no suggestion from them that the young people presented a terrorism risk. So one option, therefore, was to divert them from PREVENT. But the practitioners were reluctant to do that because they were worried that the young people's needs wouldn't be met. They would probably have had to wait a couple of years for meaningful support via another route. So instead, they created a category and they called this new category the school shooting ideology. The rationale was that this would send them down the PREVENT pathway and ensure access to the necessary support much more quickly. Now, I tell that anecdote for a couple of reasons. I think it's quite interesting, but other localities, other PREVENT teams within the UK probably did, well, I know they did, take a different approach. So there's concerns there about consistency. For me as a legal scholar, there's concerns there about the rule of law to see such radically different approaches being taken in different localities. And so I think it's important to try and dig a bit deeper to produce some clarity around ideology in order to ensure greater consistency. And this has really come across to me quite powerfully over the last 3 days. I've seen a variety of opinions throughout the symposium about questions concerning ideology. Are behaviours like violence fixation and fascination with gore ideologically driven? It's been interesting to hear different perspectives on this, particularly perspectives drawing on rich empirical data. But we had good discussions about it in the Tech Against Terrorism workshop earlier today. Chay Tibby talked about it in his presentation yesterday, and Felix Newman also touched on this in his presentation on Monday. So I would suggest there are at least two questions that need further reflection. First is, how do we define ideology? The discussions around mixed, unclear, or unstable ideologies seems to imply that other ideologies are coherent and are stable. Yet I wonder whether that's contestable in itself. So how do we define ideology? And second, what role must ideology, however we define it, what role must ideology play for behaviour to be classed as extremist? Must the ideology drive the behaviour for it to be classed as extremist? Well, to me personally, that seems unlikely. I don't think we applied that threshold to IS supporters during the height of Islamic State. It was accepted, I think, at that time that at least a significant proportion of those that travelled were driven more by peer networks or the perceived coolness of the subculture, or simply the fascination with violence. They were concerned more with those things than the group's theology, I would argue. The second reason for sharing the Swansea anecdote is I've been quite struck during the symposium by practitioners' insights about the importance of the language that we use. Language matters. Now, we're not talking exclusively about young people here. Ali Fisher, in his presentation yesterday, explained that the biggest consumers of online gore in his research were aged 25 to 39. So I'm not suggesting that this is exclusively a young person phenomenon. But if we do focus on young people just for a moment, there are long-standing principles of youth justice that need to be borne in mind, not least diversion and labelling. So the conference has highlighted the importance of the language we use when talking to young people. Using terms like ideology and extremism may not be productive when talking to young people. And I think the same goes for the language we use to talk about them. As we've been reminded in several presentations, perpetrators are often also victims. Young people that pose a risk may also be at risk themselves. And this came across quite strongly in the first panel this morning on neurodiversity, in the presentations from Nadine Sorman, Rachel Worthington, and Zainab Al-Attar. So I think there's more work to be done within the research community in collaboration and discussion with practitioner and policy communities about these questions around ideology. So that was the thing that I think has been prominent. Turning to what I would suggest has been latent, but nevertheless a theme of the symposium, it's well-being and concerns around researcher and the well-being of others that are professionally tasked in this area. And well-being here in two senses. First is the awful content that we may have to look at in the course of our work. I was quite struck in the presentation by Stefan Bale and Lewis Brace when they were talking about the analysis they were doing. They were guided to an extent by what they felt able to look at and what they simply did not want to look at. And these concerns about the effect of this content on our well-being resonates with the experience of those in other sectors. Think of some of the investigative journalism that has exposed the conditions in which content moderators work. Or there was a very good piece in Studies in Conflict and Terrorism a few years ago, which was an ethnographic study of London Metropolitan Police's counter-terrorism internet referral unit, in which the officers that work in the CTIRU talked about how they tried to cope with the demands of viewing horrific content on a regular basis. So that's the first sense. What is the effect of looking at this content regularly over a long period of time? But there's also another well-being concern that I think has been present throughout, and that's the targeting of researchers for their work. And I was struck by this in Cynthia's keynote on the very first morning, when she talked about the abusive emails and the phone calls that she gets after media appearances. Now, I'm terrified just by the prospect of doing a media appearance. So to go into a media appearance knowing that you may well suffer that backlash afterwards, I would simply not do media, full stop. So that really struck me. And it, in the rest of the symposium since then, I've had conversations with some other researchers who actually have moved out of academia into the private sector in order to avoid having a public profile and to make the trolling stop. So it is causing particularly young researchers to move out of academia altogether. So there are really important issues around well-being that I think have been latent throughout, and it's important we draw them to the surface. There is a project called Reassure, which Voxpol has helped to support, and the Reassure project has tried to address some of these issues. The team behind that project are currently exploring the experiences of those from different professions to see what lessons can be learned and shared across sectors. So if you'd be interested in learning more about that work or even potentially participating in it, please do let me know and I'll put you in touch with the Reassure team. But in my experience, one of the best things I've heard on this issue of well-being came from a former team leader at BBC Monitoring. He gave a presentation. He'd had to grapple with these issues as a team leader of colleagues that were looking at horrific content regularly. And in his presentation, he gave 10 pieces of advice. Number one, what he said was the most effective thing he'd found in his team was a weekly, informal, 1-hour team outing to go and get tea and cake together. A time to share experiences, seek advice, and just generally talk about things. And that, I think, brings us back to community, which was actually where we started at the beginning of day one, the importance of community in this space. Community can be so important in helping to counteract these threats to our well-being. And it's why events like this are so important. So I'd like to once again thank Avert for organising it, making it so constructive and enjoyable. Michelle is going to come up and do the formal thanks, but I know the one person she won't thank in her thanks is herself. So maybe we could just give Michelle a thanks before she does the other thank yous.
Thank you very much, Stuart. That was very kind of you. One of the things that Avert has always wanted to do, from its very inception, research for the public good and research that engages with practitioners so that the work that we do doesn't just sit on a shelf, getting dusty somewhere, but actually gets out there, has an impact, and is used. And I would just like to share, before I do the formal thanks, a brief example of how this can work. So this wonderful book called My School is a Safe Place. This book, which is by Stuart Williams, an ex-police officer, but the idea for this book, where's Rach? Without my glass, I can't, yeah, there she is up the back. This book came about because Rachel Hodge from Tasmania Police, who is an Avert stalwart, I think she's been at every symposium that we've run, heard a presentation last year from a researcher who was talking about, given the age drop that we've seen, right, where younger and younger people are radicalizing and where our settings, in schools are continuing to provide challenges, our ability to engage with very young people. This researcher was saying, what do we do when we need to engage kids in primary school, right? Our educational approaches, certainly in this country, for the most part, are geared towards secondary school. But what about the kids who are even younger? Do we need to be reaching them? And this book about My School is a Safe Place actually came about as a result of that presentation. Rach said she went home, thought, what a great question, talked to some colleagues. So this fantastic book, is an example of the kind of practical outcomes that are community focused and engaged, practitioner relevant. This is now being discussed at YAMHAG, which is the Youth and Mental Health Advisory Group within the Countering Violent Extremism Subcommittee of the Australia-New Zealand Counter-Terrorism Committee for a national rollout. So for those of us who have been involved with Avert for a long time, to see outcomes like this, and that spark that happens between research and practice is a really fabulous thing. So thanks so much, Rachel, for sharing this with us. I would like to thank a number of people. Now, first of all, I'd like to thank all of you as participants. You are the survivors group because you're still here and you're still alive at the end of day 3. But in all seriousness, I have a list of thanks. First of all, I would really like to thank Julian, my co-convener in Avert. Julian and I started working together as co-conveners earlier this year. And, what a pleasure to put this symposium together with you. We've all benefited from your wise counsel, your steady hand, and your unflappable nature, unlike my hysteria. Your unflappable nature, has been a really welcome compliment, as well as, of course, your intellectual contributions. To Stuart and Voxpol and TASM, What a thrill and what a pleasure. I think that AVERT has gotten a new lease on life through this collaboration. We've got slightly different cohort of presenters and participants to be able to really develop these rich insights into online extremism, new trends and new dynamics, with more emphasis, I think, perhaps on some technological emergent developments and emergent technologies than before, has just been so exciting. So it has been absolutely wonderful to collaborate. And you and both you personally and also Voxpol and TASM as organizations have been incredibly generous. So thank you very much for that. The organizing committee, all of whom are named in the acknowledgement section, which is on the last page of your program, so you can review those names at your leisure. They have worked really hard and long. We start organizing each of these symposia almost at the beginning of the year, right? Around February, I kid you not, around February and March. So people on the organizing committee have been working almost all of this year, to develop the theme, think about the presenters, review papers, and all the rest. So a big shout out to them. Also to our lovely volunteers, Amy, Jordan, Luke, Joel, Taylor, and Rahel, who have provided fantastic support and assistance and guidance with those little cards that say you are about to be dead if you don't stop speaking. It's a very important part of any kind of conference management. To GNet, the Global Network for Extremism and Technology, our big thanks for being so generous in sponsoring the networking reception, which the informal feedback suggests many of you enjoyed, which was really great to hear. Enormous warm thanks to our keynote speaker, Cynthia Miller-Idriss. What an amazing way to start, this 3-day symposium. Could we give another big hand to Cynthia? The rich insights and, the laser sharp presentation that she gave, which has been referred to again and again and again over the last 3 days. So as people have, that work is really resonant. It's identified challenges that we're going to continue to grapple with, and we have learned an incredible amount from the work that you have so generously shared, Cynthia. To Jess and Louise from Deacon Events, who have done remarkable behind-the-scenes work in terms of all the logistics and making the wall sort of move when it's supposed to move, and done all the registration and all the rest. To Haley, who has managed the volunteers and also our higher degree bar research panel presenters. Couldn't have done it without you, Haley. You've been fantastic, as always. To all of the presenters, of course, who spent time, effort, labor, and in some cases money to actually fly here. We are so grateful for the work that you do and for your willingness to share it in an environment like this. And as you can imagine, last but certainly not least, the biggest, deepest thanks to Isel Ross. Isel over there with her hand. Isel is the AVERT coordinator. Isel made this possible. Isel, who has slaved for months and months and months, all the correspondence, all the logistics, all the organization, all the printouts. She has worked during the day. She has worked evenings. She has worked weekends. She has never slept. She has barely eaten. She has given beyond, way, way beyond 100%. And she has maintained graciousness, cheer, patience, and she's like Boadicea, right? You certainly don't want to cross her, let me tell you that. But this symposium is really your symposium, Isel, and we can't thank you enough. And with that, we are done. So thank you so much for coming, and we really hope to see you next year. Cheers.